Ecclesiastes 3. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And again, that phrase under heaven is important. Every time you see that phrase, understand what it's talking about. Either the phrase under heaven or under the sun refers to the things of creation. He says there is a time to be born and a time to die. That really ought to be, I think, self-evident. But the moment that something comes to live in this world, we know that what will also happen? Something will die. Whatever it is that comes to life will die. What is that not true of? What about grass or trees or flowers? What happens to them? What about fish? Turtles, snakes, dogs, cats, gerbils. Some things' lifespans are really, really short. If they become the pet of my daughter, that's another story. Everything, and that includes man. Hebrews 9 affirms what? A time to be born and a time to die. Everything created. It will not exist. And that's a truth, by the way, that tells us that this statement, there's a time to be born and a time to die, extends all the way to what? What we call the universe. All that which is created, which had its birth and beginning in God and will have its end by the hand of God as well. There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. If you plant for the intent of what? Of reaping some harvest from it. Now, we may not literally pluck, as in grain or grapes or something like that. We might harvest in some other way, or we might just enjoy the beauty of it. Sometimes we plant flowers and stuff in gardens just to enjoy their beauty, right? But you plant them with the idea of bearing the benefit and the fruit of that activity. There is a time for one of them, there's a time for the other. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. Now, what is true so far about this list? Every line is setting forth what? When you look at this, born, die, plant, and plucking up what is planted, kill, heal, what are these words? They're extremes. They're extremes on a continuum. Birth is the beginning of a thing, and death is the end of a thing. One is the opposite extreme of the other.
Well, he starts off by saying there's a time to be born and a time to die. And then he proceeds from birth to the death, with everything in between, vanity, therefore,
right.
Total precedent in the book.
It is quite interesting. Now, it's important. I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't know that I would have. We have to keep in mind that this is him examining the world through his eyes as he sees it. So he's talking about what is under the heavens. And everything has an end. And everything in between those extremes, as John just pointed out, is vanity. We're going to see that unfold throughout the remainder of the book.
Yeah, and it almost goes back to the point to where, until you get old time,
Right.
you forget. But we don't think much about life but a vapor. And from the time you're born to the time you die, that vapor is going to fill in everything in between there. And at this point in time, he's saying all is vanity. Then he goes on in God's word shortly, and what is, what was to be, whatever was, and whatever will be, it's purely going to the past.
if the material world is all that there is, I got to ask you, Mike, are we streaming? Because I still don't have a video showing. Somebody likes our video, but I don't actually have a notification that the video's on. Facebook is being hard to get along with nowadays. As we talk about this, realize that what he's saying is that when you look at the material world, if that's all that there is, then as Paul would later write to the church at Corinth, if we have hoped in this life only, we're of all men to be most pitied. It sure is a pitiable state if this is what life's about. Because if I'm born, I'm just going to die. If I plant, it's just going to need to be pulled up at some point because it dies. There is a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh. What's the difference between the time to weep and the time to laugh? Temporary circumstances, and that's actually the point. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that is given credit with making this line famous. This too shall pass. When you're in the midst of a horrible event, just realize that this too shall pass. It has its limits. And so if you're in the midst of laughter and joy, what's going to happen? Eventually there's going to be a time to mourn. If this life is all that there is, everything is temporary.
Mike, all the thoughts you're speaking about now lead you to the point to where, yes, all of this is, but it isn't that. You look at what the Scripture says about the world. We live all of our world up until a point in time, loving the world and things that are of the world. What we do, we begin to attach to things in the world, loving this and loving that of the world, and it takes a lot to undo all that you've done before you realize it.
Exactly. And we know that Jesus taught that we should not love the world or the things of the world. That we should instead put our treasures in heavenly things, not on things that are on the earth. And all throughout the New Testament we're admonished not to love the world or the things in the world. Because the things of the world ultimately come down to the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. This is dealing with all, this is laying the foundation for why all of that is true. Or laying the foundation for us to understand how all of that is true. I think that's a better way to express that. There's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. We can assume for purposes of our discussion tonight that these are the same stones. That at one point in time I need to gather them together, the next point in time I need to get rid of them. Maybe these are stones that I use to build my home with, and I collect them up and I build the walls out of these stones. But if I build a house, guess what? It's eventually going to happen. It's going to be destroyed. There's going to be a time to scatter those stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. All of these things happen on the earth. And though sometimes these times can go longer than we want them to, periods of mourning, periods of sorrow, periods of destruction, periods of war, they're not fun to experience necessarily. They may go on longer than we want them to, but the fact of the matter is, history proves that what happens to them? They pass They go away. We move from a time to war to a time for peace, eventually. What gain has the worker from his toil? I told you that this is really an extension of what we studied about at the end of chapter 2. That statement makes it very clear. Remember, he was talking at the end of chapter 2 about the vanity of toil and working hard to amass things on the earth. What gain has the worker from his toil? That whole list is about the futility of working for things that are on this earth, of collecting things that are on this earth, of valuing things that are on this earth. Yes, sir.
And that's where another good point, talking about you working all your life for what? You're going to retire, so you start collecting, you start building up, and for your retirement, before you die, you'll be working all your life, then why aren't you working all your life for retirement in heaven, instead of loving the things of this world and collecting all those, you ain't taking any other with you.
Yeah, and sometimes you work your whole life and you store it for your retirement, and then you get to your retirement and ain't nothing there left. So you've worked all your life so that you'll have an easy time at retirement, and it's not there. What gain has the worker from his toil? Listen, if it's all about this world, what gain does the worker have? We're going to talk about that as we go through this chapter. When he gets down to the end of this chapter, he's going to get down to the real crux of the matter about life in this world. If we're looking at only our existence under the heavens, only the material things that we know and see and can touch and interact with, we're going to look at what the end of life is for us. And that's going to forever answer the question of whether or not it needs to be first on our list of pursuits. What gain has the worker from his toil? Verse 9, I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. And so God has given us work, a task, a commission. He's made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He's put eternity into man's heart. Now see, here's where the problem comes in. Man is inherently aware of what? That there's something else besides time. That there's something beyond time. That there's a continuance. And that right there puts most of the challenge to life for mankind. Just so you know, your little pet rover, he doesn't realize that there's eternity. You know what the only thing he's concerned with? Right this moment. That's all he cares about. Yes?
There are several earthly examples where the hurricane wiped everybody's stuff out, and then they realized after they mourned over the material goods that they're very glad that all of their family survived. And it's like a lesson that they learned, maybe temporarily.
Yep. And I'm going to tell you something. Family is extremely valuable as well, but guess what? It passes too. So that's not where we put our priorities either, at least not what's first. Doesn't mean that we don't have a priority system that includes family responsibility. But it's part of what comes and goes. Because guess what happens to all of our parents eventually? They die. What happens to our spouses? They die. Sometimes our children even die before us, and we have to deal with that. That's really hard for people to deal with. I've talked to a lot of people who have buried their children, and I get the same exact expression from all of them. It's not supposed to happen this way. I'm not supposed to bury my child. But guess what? Sometimes that's what happens. He's made everything beautiful in His time. He's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Now, without destroying our future study in chapter 8, I do want to go read a couple of verses from chapter 8 where he expands on the idea that we just read. So, He's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. What exactly is he talking about, and what can we learn? Over in chapter 8, we're going to read, let's look at starting at verse 15. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. That's exactly what he said at the end of chapter 2, right? To eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that has been done on earth, how neither day nor night does one's eyes sleep, or eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out, even though a wise man claims to know he cannot find out. So we have an awareness of eternity, and I think the implied implication of this is an awareness of God. And if we set out to understand everything that God is doing, keep in mind all of this is qualified as being under the heavens, or under the sun, or on the earth. His work on the earth. We're not even going to talk about His work outside of the sphere of our creation. But just the work that He's doing right here among us. Can we know what God's doing? Can we search it out and find it? Can we ever know everything that God has done and everything that God is doing and everything that God will do? And the answer is no. No one. The only way we can know what God has done is how? He has to tell us. Now, how important does that make His revelation then? If the only way we can know what God is doing is to listen to what He has said, because we can't find it on our own, then it becomes extremely important to listen to Him. And so we go back. What verse was that? Verse 11. He's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We don't have the capacity, through our own experience in life on this earth, to know and understand all of the work of God. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. So he starts reaching some conclusions, and he says, you know what? We've got this busy task about us of trying to figure out and understand these concepts of eternity and purpose and all that kind of stuff, and yet we can't find any of these things out on our own. And so what we need to do is to just be joyful and to do good for as long as we're alive. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all of his toil. This is a gift, is God's gift to man. Again, we're looking at things from the perspective of under the heaven, from under the stars. And what he's saying is if we can't answer these questions, and if we can't control these things, and if we can't determine these things, then what we need to do is be content in our circumstances. To try to be good and be content in our circumstances. That which is, verse 15, Well, let's back up to verse 14. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before Him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. All of that is just expressing the futility of man. What can we add to the world? What can we take from the world? And the answer to that is nothing. So what's the end for man? Again, we're looking at this from the perspective of what we see under the sun. We're searching out through our eyes and our wisdom what life is all about. And this is what conclusion we come to as we look around at everything. Moreover, I saw that under the sun, in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. I mentioned at the beginning of class that if your family has a pet rover, what are you going to be doing one day? You're going to be burying him. Or we won't talk about the other options that Lafayette Parish gives you. If you call the parish, they tell you to just put him in the trash can. What happens to men? Same. When you're looking at it from under the sun, from what we can find out, from what we can know, we have the same men as the beasts. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Again, this is a physical appraisal of things. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of beast goes down to the earth? Do we have any way of knowing about the spirit of man and about what happens to the spirit of man from examining things on the earth in time? No. The only way we know about the fact that we're made in the image of God and that there's something different between us and the beast of the ground is because what? Because God told us in Genesis chapter 1 and in Genesis chapter 2. If we just look on the surface, both bodies die, both bodies get buried, they return to the earth that they came from. How do we know about anything else? Can we see it? Can we measure it? Can we come to the conclusion? Can't see any of those things. One dies as well as the other. They all go to the earth. That's what we can know physically. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes up or the spirit of beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that's his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? What happens after this life is over? Any way of us knowing that? Apart from God revealing it to us? Not apart from God. And so all of this is explaining why the toil of life is empty and vain. Because if we look at life just in terms of our time on this earth, what hope do we have? And again, this parallels nicely to the argument that Paul makes to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 15, where they had some folks there who were denying the resurrection. And Paul says, if there is no resurrection, and all we have to hope in is in this life we're of all men to be most pitied. Because this life, we just die and go back to the dust that we came from. Is that the kind of thing you want to put your hope in? You want to put your hope in your physical strength or in your body or in what you're able to accomplish in your life? Listen, there's a lot of people that put all their hope in what they can accomplish in their life. In January, when the president takes his oath of office, do you know what the conversation begins to be the very next day when he begins working? His legacy. What is this going to do to your legacy? We're going to have to build your legacy. You need to do something to leave a legacy. You've got to have a purpose for your presidency. It's all about what they can accomplish.
That's what he's saying. That's what the president's saying. That's what
Sure. Well, that's what most men think. That's what the point that we want to focus on in class, though, is there is no legacy.
You know, like, back in my mind, we know the Old Testament is two different from the New Testament.
Yep.
It's almost to the point where I think that once you understand right and wrong and your way to God, you ought to go to the Bible before you start studying those. Put your mind right in what you are and what you are not in this world, and you go forward from there to be a Christian. It's almost like these prophecies, the words in Job 2, Psalm. It's so important where you can understand your relationship with God through what He tells you not to do and to do in this world, and how to understand what you can and can't do. Because you're going to die. Understand that when you're young. I didn't.
I think most of us don't appreciate. Now, keep in mind again, I'm going to keep stressing this as we go through this book. He's examining things under the heavens. He's examining things under the sun. He's examining things on the earth. Listen to what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and its works that are done on it will be destroyed. Will be burned up. Will be exposed, depending on what translation you're reading. Could be any of those things. It all means the same thing. There's a reason why Peter says, and the works done on it. The labor that we do in life and any proceeds from that labor ends when the earth ends. There is no legacy. That's why we shouldn't place our hope in such things. What we need to focus on is much bigger than those things.
James 4:13, where it talks about, what we want to do today, tomorrow, or anything else. And at the end of the day, that's if God willing.
Right.
Our life is just a vapor. It could end 5 seconds from now, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 decades, 5 millennia. We don't know. But only the Lord knows.
Life is but a vapor, and then the next phrase is even more important, and then it vanishes. The generations after us, they forget, it goes away. There is no legacy. We don't have a legacy. Even those among us who have the greatest legacies, it's done away with. It doesn't have a purpose anymore, by the way. Once the earth is over and once time is no more, there's no purpose in those things. That is, in fact, the reason why he says it's vanity. Because if it is connected to this earth, and that is the end, then every benefit goes with it. That's why you don't put your hope in the material world, in your material existence, in what you can accomplish in your works. The reason you put your hope in Christ is because He's eternal. He's heavenly. He's outside of that which is created. But we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because he doesn't come to that conclusion until way in chapter 12. From dust to dust. I saw that there is nothing better that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Who can bring us to see what will be after us? God. And that, my friends, is why it's important for us to know what God has said. Because the whole focus of chapter 3, really the end of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3 is we can work and work and work and work and work and look and look and look and try to answer those questions that arise from an awareness of our eternality. And we can't find them on our own. We can search all day, every day, and never sleep. Remember when he said that? That your eyes don't close day or night? What verse was that? I'm not going to have time to find it. But anyway, maybe it was when we read it over in chapter 8. It may have been in that text. Yep, that's where it is. Chapter 8 and verse 16. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night does one eyes sleep. We can work and work and work all day long, and we're never going to find out the works of God except He reveals Himself to us. He tells us who He is and what He's done. And He went to the extreme of doing so by leaving the glories of heaven and coming in the form of a servant and living among us. There's just something to go sit around and think about for a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of months, a couple of years. God with us, the significance of that.